They thought they could intimidate the old man, that the disrespect of decades of war and suffering would go unnoticed. They were wrong. What happened in that roadside restaurant will make you rethink everything about underestimating someone. Have you ever heard of people who seem to be the last man standing, veterans who have been through wars, who have life stories that could change the world, but who prefer to keep quiet? Well, one such man was in a roadside restaurant. It wasn't the first time he'd been there, but that day something would change. Something none of them imagined, especially a motorcycle gang that was about to learn a brutal lesson. The scene looked like one of those common roadside restaurants, but the veteran knew that nothing would ever be the same. He sat there in silence, his gaze distant. His plate of simple food was in front of him, but his mind was far away, reliving the battles he had already faced. He had seen many men like these who were now entering, loud and arrogant, trying to impress others with their posture. A gang of motorcyclists who hardly knew where they were stepping, or rather, who was there. The veteran didn't want any trouble. He was there for a quiet meal, something simple. He wasn't there to be the center of attention, to provoke anyone, or to show that his life had already been harder than any of those people could understand. He was there to lose himself in his own thoughts, to try to forget the nights when the war seemed to have no end, to forget the memories of moments that no human being should have experienced. But the gang seemed determined to force the old man to react, even if he tried to ignore them. The first thing he noticed was the way they entered, as if they dominated the place. The loud motorcycles, the smoke from their cigarettes, and the rude laughter that echoed around the room. They weren't there to eat. They were there to mark their territory. And there, at the end table, the veteran, sitting alone, was the perfect target. The old man was easy prey for these men, who saw in him only a reflection of what they considered a bygone generation, with no relevance to the modern world. He thought about ignoring them. He had already learned that the greatest strength was often silence. But as time passed, he felt something different, a growing discomfort, not because of the words that were spoken, but because of the lack of respect. Their every laugh was like a blade cutting through what he believed to be the last refuge of his peace. They were doing it so blatantly, as if the presence of an older, quiet man was a joke. The veteran was not someone who was easily bothered, but when he began to notice the disdainful looks they were throwing at the other customers, the staff, and, above all, at him, something inside him began to stir. It wasn't anger he felt, but something deeper, something that made his soul revolt. It was contempt for his experience, for the history he carried, something he knew these motorcyclists would never understand. When one of the men approached, he realized that he could no longer simply turn away and pretend that nothing was happening. The biker, with a sarcastic laugh, made a comment about the veteran's food, saying that it looked like something he would eat in a shelter for the elderly. The group laughed, a loud laugh full of debauchery. The veteran, still silent, didn't move a muscle. He already knew what that comment meant. He already knew what was coming. He no longer feared words. But then another gang member came closer. This time, the motorcyclist was armed, not physically, but with his venomous voice and threatening posture. He said in a low voice so that everyone could hear, "Have you ever heard of respect, old man? Or did that die out on the battlefield?" The room fell into a momentary silence, and the veteran felt as if the weight of all his memories had fallen on him, as if his mind had gone back to those dark days when he and his friends fought tooth and nail, not just for survival, but for honor. He knew that those people would never understand what he had been through. Even worse, they didn't want to. It was a clear provocation, an attempt to humiliate him, to undermine his dignity in a public way. Those men weren't just mocking him. They were mocking his life, his struggle. It was a personal attack. The veteran looked at the man who had spoken, his expression calm, but inside he was bracing himself. He knew he couldn't let it go. Not for him, but for all those who had fallen alongside him, for all those who had suffered and died in battle. If he remained silent now, he would be betraying everything he had already done. He didn't need to justify himself, but he wouldn't allow a lack of respect to be the end of the story. He had made promises he wouldn't break. And that motorcyclist was about to understand the cost of what he was doing. The veteran looked around. The other customers were visibly annoyed, but they were afraid to intervene. They knew they couldn't. What had happened there was not something that a simple act of intervention could solve. They knew that the veteran, even though he was already an old man and physically weakened, was someone who had lived more in one day than many would in a lifetime. He knew what it was like to fight for your life, and more importantly, he knew what it was like to fight with your soul. But something was about to happen. Something that would change the dynamics of that situation in a way that none of them could have predicted. The veteran stood up slowly, his eyes steady, his body carrying the experience of a life full of pain and glory. The gang watched him, but without realizing that the game had changed. What seemed like a simple provocation was about to be countered in a way that only someone who had already faced hell could understand. The story of that motorcycle gang was about to end in a way they had never imagined. They were about to learn the most painful lesson of their lives, and the veteran knew it. Not for himself, but for the honor of those who had fought alongside him. He didn't rush forward. He didn't do anything to indicate that he was looking for a fight. No, he wasn't there to prove anything to anyone. He was just trying to honor what should never have been forgotten: respect. Something that motorcyclists seemed to lack, and something that he, in his life of suffering and war, knew he could no longer tolerate. The motorcyclist who had made the provocation was standing, waiting for some reaction. The debauched smile was still on his face, as if he was sure that the veteran would be intimidated, that he would bow to the arrogance of the youth. But the veteran was more than prepared for this. He had faced more than enough to know that true strength lay not in arrogance, but in the ability to resist, patience, and, above all, self-control. He knew that what was about to happen would not be a physical battle, but a battle of souls. The other gang members watched from afar, still laughing, unaware of the danger they were causing. They thought everything was under control, that the old man was just an easy victim, an old-fashioned figure who could do nothing but bow down to their threatening presence. But there was something else there, something they couldn't see. The veteran, with his steady gaze and unwavering stance, was about to show them that it wasn't about physical strength, but the strength of the spirit. And he was about to bring everything he had learned over the years to that table, to that little road lost in the middle of nowhere, where the story would unfold in a way they would never have imagined. He walked up to the provocative motorcyclist without haste, as if time were his ally. The room was silent now. All eyes were on him. Some tried not to look directly, but the tension was palpable. The veteran stopped a few steps away from the man who was challenging him, without even looking directly into his eyes. He looked around, seeing the other gang members still with cynical smiles on their faces. They didn't understand. They had no idea what they were about to face. But the veteran knew. He took a step forward, and the sound of his boots colliding with the ground resounded like an echo from the distant past. The gang, which until then had been laughing, suddenly stopped. The veteran spoke, but his voice was low, controlled, like thunder about to burst, but contained by the strength of years of discipline. It's not the words that worry me. It's the attitudes. He paused for a moment, as if reflecting, and then spoke again. I was taught to fight for something greater than any of you could understand. For something that goes beyond what you think you know about respect. His voice was calm, but there was something in it that conveyed immeasurable strength. The motorcyclist who had made the provocation took a step backwards, an unconscious movement. He was beginning to realize that this man was not like the other elderly people he used to bully. He wasn't like the other easy targets. The veteran continued, "You think you're the masters of the world, that you can just walk through here and humiliate anyone. But what you don't know is that there's a cost to that. A cost you can't afford." The tension in the room was palpable. The gang was beginning to realize that the veteran's words were heavier than any physical blow they could deliver. The gang leader, the most imposing of them all, finally stood up. His height, physical strength, and the confidence he radiated seemed to make him feel invincible. He took a step towards the veteran, his eyes full of disdain. "Do you think you can teach me anything, old man?" The veteran looked at him with a gaze that seemed to pierce through his soul, as if the challenger were a child trying to understand the ocean. It wasn't about physical power, it wasn't about who had the most strength or the most muscles. It was about who had the most courage. And the veteran had seen more in one day than that man would ever see in his entire life. The veteran remained silent for a moment, and the atmosphere around him seemed to stop. Time seemed to slow down, as if the whole world was waiting. Then the veteran spoke, his voice low but firm. "I've been where you are. I felt like you. I too was young, I too was arrogant. But life, my friend, will teach you that respect is not earned by brute force. It's earned through integrity, the courage to face adversity, and, above all, the wisdom to know when to fight and when to keep quiet." He took another step towards the motorcyclist, his eyes fixed on his. "You think you can frighten me, but you don't know what it's like to live in hell. I've been there, and I survived." The gang members were now completely quiet. Some of them began to move uncomfortably, as if they were beginning to feel the pressure of the conversation. The leader, although still arrogant, felt something changing inside him. Something was breaking his confidence. He didn't know what, but he was beginning to realize that there was something else there. Something he couldn't confront with physical force, harsh words, or cynical laughter. The veteran knew that the crucial moment was coming. He was about to show these young men what it really meant to live a life of honor. He knew they wouldn't fully understand now, but he was willing to teach them what he could. Not for himself, but for all those who, like him, had already fought and sacrificed. He looked at the biker once more, his eyes firm, but without anger. Just a serene determination, like the calm of a storm about to break. The gang was about to learn a lesson that would change their lives forever. They were about to discover that, sometimes, the real heroes are not those who shout the loudest or have the most physical strength. The real heroes are those who, through silence and wisdom, earn respect in a way that no one can take away. The heavy silence in the room was abruptly broken when the gang leader took a step toward the veteran. He was no longer laughing. There was a palpable tension in the air, a suspense charged with emotion. The veteran knew that this moment had arrived, the moment he had dreaded so much, but at the same time, the moment he had been waiting for, almost anxiously. It was now or never. The gang leader approached, his furious, arrogant eyes fixed on the veteran. He was determined to make his presence felt, to show that respect would only come when he imposed his authority. It was a question of honor for him now, a question of showing his companions that he was the alpha, that no one could dare challenge him, especially an old man, a veteran of the war who was clearly out of his time. But the veteran didn't back down. He didn't blink. His gaze was deeper than the leader could understand. It was a gaze that reflected not only the suffering and pain of a man who had faced the worst of humanity, but also the wisdom acquired over decades of internal and external struggle. The veteran knew that the leader's muscles and arrogance were only a facade, that inside him there was a void that could only be filled by a deeper understanding of life, respect, and true strength. And that's what he was there to show. The motorcyclist stood a few centimeters away, his chest rising and falling heavily with the anger that burned inside him. He raised his hand as if to strike a blow, and it was at that moment that the veteran, with a smooth and precise movement, placed the palm of his hand against the leader's chest, preventing him from advancing. The leader stopped. His eyes widened in confusion, as if he was trying to understand what had just happened. He was ready to attack, but something made him hesitate. The veteran's calm was like an invisible barrier, something that held him there, as if he were facing something much bigger than just an older man. It was then that the veteran spoke, no longer with the calm voice of before, but with an intensity that made every word sound like thunder. "Do you think you've intimidated me with your size, your strength, your shouting? Do you think you can beat someone who has been through everything you're about to go through? You're young, you have energy and courage, but you don't know what it's like to withstand pain, what it's like to be tested to the limit and come back stronger. You have no idea how true respect is earned, not by brute force, but by the ability to control your impulses, to know when to fight and when to simply remain calm." He paused, and his eyes were now fixed on the leader, as if seeing through him, as if seeing the man he had once been. I was taught that true courage is not made of muscles or words. It comes from the mind, the heart, the soul. And you, my friend, are still learning that lesson." The leader, at that moment, began to realize that there was something much bigger than himself involved. He was facing a man who didn't need to prove anything. He didn't need to show that he was stronger, faster, or younger. The veteran, with his imposing presence, had challenged his world in a way he couldn't understand. And the gang, who had previously been laughing and enjoying themselves, began to realize it too. The laughter died down and a tension, much denser than before, hung over everyone there. The leader, for the first time, felt a growing unease inside him. He knew he was at a crossroads. Either he would continue to act with the arrogance of someone who had always been in control, or he would begin to understand that, when faced with a man like the veteran, he needed to give up the mask of superiority he wore. The veteran, sensing that the moment was at its peak, took a step back. "I don't want to fight with you," he said calmly. "Not because I'm afraid of losing, but because the real battle isn't here. It's not with punches or kicks. The real battle is inside you, inside all of us. And you're still trying to understand that." He looked at the other gang members who were now silent, their expressions confused, but also reflecting a change, a realization that they were witnessing something much bigger than they thought. "You're going to have a much harder road than I've ever had, young man. And I'm not saying this to threaten you, but to warn you. Because when you realize what really matters, when you discover that respect doesn't come from violence, you'll be ready to be something more than a shadow of your former self." The gang leader stood still, speechless, and for the first time, he began to doubt his own strength. He was big, strong, and always in control, but something about the veteran, his calm, and the weight of his words made him question everything he believed about power, respect, and strength. The veteran wasn't trying to intimidate him. He wasn't looking for a quick or easy victory. He was simply revealing something the leader didn't yet know, that true power doesn't manifest itself in punches, but in the ability to dominate oneself. The atmosphere became more tense, and the other bikers began to move away, one by one, as if they were finally realizing that they were in dangerous territory, that the old man they had despised was no ordinary person. He was, in fact, a man who had faced life's worst situations and come out unscathed. And that made them somehow start to question their own choices, their own beliefs. The gang leader took one last look at the veteran, his eyes now showing a mixture of respect and insecurity. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know how to react. He was no longer in control, and it was eating him up inside. It was then that the veteran, with a simple gesture, turned and walked back to his desk. He didn't turn to look at the leader or the others. He didn't need to. He knew that night something had changed. Something profound, something that could not be undone. He hadn't won through strength, but through wisdom, experience, and silent resistance. And that moment, for everyone there, would become a memory that would never be forgotten. As the veteran walked away, the silence in the roadside restaurant was absolute. The gang leader stood still, as if in shock, trying to process what had just happened. His eyes could no longer focus, as if something inside him had broken, something he had never imagined possible. The veteran, without saying another word, sipped his coffee and left behind a group of men who now saw themselves not as superiors, but as mere young men trying to find their own way in a world they still didn't understand. They were no longer the masters of the street, no longer the unattainable. Now they were just men, human, fallible. The gang leader finally took a step back, the tension that had been consuming him beginning to dissipate. He looked at the other members, who now no longer looked at him with the same blind reverence as before. The veteran's words had touched something deep, something that could not be explained with punches and threats, but with the simple truth that external force is not always what counts. True power, true respect, came from within, from a mind that knew how to control anger, from a heart that knew the value of respectful silence, and from a man who knew when to fight, but above all, when to stop. There, at that moment, were no winners or losers. There was a man who showed others what it means to be truly strong. And the motorcyclists, although trapped in their own worldviews, would never forget that night. They were no longer the same. Something had changed, perhaps in their hearts, perhaps in their minds. When the veteran got up to leave, no one dared stop him. He had earned respect not for his physical strength, but for the depth of his spirit, and this left a profound impact, not only on the motorcyclist, but also on everyone who was there, witnessing the power of silent wisdom. The veteran is gone, but his lesson will remain. He proved once again that true strength is not measured in shouting or fighting, but in the ability to remain calm in the midst of the storm. Just for those of you who like a good story and have watched to the end, leave your comment below from which city you're watching, and I'll leave a heart in your comment. Bye, and see you in the next video.